I call the Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, given this bill's genesis, I should be here welcoming its report back from the Select Committee, but I'm not. Although Labour will not oppose the second reading of this bill, there is not much enthusiasm on this side of the House for what has been actually a squandered opportunity. Never before in our history has there been such an in-depth review of alcohol as conducted by the New Zealand Law Commission. It was an incredible review, and I want to place on record a tribute to the New Zealand Law Commission for the work that they did. They did an outstanding job. They heard submissions all around the country. They went out after hours and they saw what alcohol was doing to our streets and to our communities, Mr Speaker, and at the same time, the level of public support for change is unprecedented. We have communities from one end of the country to the other taking to the streets to oppose the granting of liquor licences. This is unprecedented. Wainuiomata, the member for that area, calls out, and I know that there are others, and Glen Innes have taken to the streets as well, and down in Christchurch we've just recently had one in the Ilam electorate, the electorate for the Minister for Earthquake Recovery, absolutely determined to have a say in what is happening in their communities. Mr Speaker, more than 3,000 New Zealanders submitted to the Law Commission on their draft report, and when we combine that with those who submitted on this bill and the previous bill, then that's over 5,000 submissions in total and just over 7,000 form submissions from interested groups and individuals. And I have to say that this bill is actually a travesty because it doesn't even begin to address the challenges that in fact were posed by the evidence that the Law Commission has put in front of the Government of New Zealand, and which should have been the basis for a bill that was introduced into the House. The bottom line is that this bill ignores what the people said they wanted. They did they did make themselves available to the corporate interests, but I'm afraid not to the people of New Zealand. The truth is that this bill adds almost nothing to the bill that I introduced into this House 3 years ago, and which had its first reading in March 2009. And if the government had amended the bill that I introduced with a supplementary order paper with the few additional elements that they've added to that basic framework, if they had referred that to a select committee by way of a supplementary order paper, then we could have actually had this bill passed and enacted by now. It could already be taking place, and we wouldn't have to have communities marching in the streets demanding something that this legislation would have already given them. And the other thing, and this is the real reason why I think that the government decided not to do it as a supplementary order paper to my bill, is that we would have had amendments dealing with the question of the breath alcohol content levels as well. The 0.08 to 0.05, that would have been in scope of the sale and supply of liquor and liquor enforcement bill, but not within scope of this bill, and that's the reason why the government didn't want to have this bill, didn't want my bill amended. They wanted a new bill so they could leave the transport amendments outside the scope of the bill. The Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, just loves to kick the tyres on these tough issues, but he doesn't like to make decisions. And that's what kicking the tyres is all about. Sometimes you actually need to have a Prime Minister who's prepared to get up and make hard decisions. And this would have been one of those decisions that I would have liked to have seen from our Prime Minister. Like a former Minister of Health who, in an election year, was prepared to put smoke-free environments on our legislative timetable, this government hasn't got what it takes. In my view, this Prime Minister doesn't have what it takes to make these decisions. It is intolerable in the wake of the evidence presented by the Law Commission. And Mr Speaker, I am particularly disappointed that this is one of the final acts of this Minister, because it is the one law reform that actually could have produced the legacy that any Minister of the Crown would have been proud of. And as a Minister who jointly spearheaded the Ministerial Committee on the Drivers of Crime some nearly 3 years ago, he should have been able to do better than this. Mr. Speaker, I went to an alcohol action conference a while ago where a number of us were asked to imagine what New Zealand would be like without alcohol damage. Now, I'm not saying without alcohol. I'm not actually putting up a proposition in terms of a wowzers argument here. I'm actually talking about what we were asked to imagine, New Zealand without alcohol damage. I immediately thought of the lives that would be saved, of the resources that would free up in our hospitals and within the health system as a whole, the resources that would flow to the justice system. Imagine the impact without alcohol damage on our police, on our courts and on our prisons. I thought about ACC levies and how they would plummet in the earners account and in the motor vehicle account. I thought of the families that would be freed from the scourge of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, but imagining New Zealand without alcohol damage is an unrealistic dream. Unfortunately, while we as a nation are not prepared to contribute to the change that would make it a reality within ourselves, our families and our communities, and then require it of this place, require it of Parliament, require us to have the courage as members of Parliament to vote for the right thing. Unfortunately, most of the public discourse around alcohol reform is self-interested, not public-spirited. That's why there's such a huge support for increasing the age to 20, but not to remove cheap booze from our supermarket shelves. And as I've said on many occasions now, law reform in its own right can't provide the total solution. What is required is a major attitudinal shift towards alcohol and the level of societal tolerance for the behaviours that it induces. But law reform that is evidence-based can make a difference to an environment that has normalised alcohol as an everyday commodity, masking the devastating consequences it is having on our communities from one end of the country to the other. Mr. Speaker, the impact of the retail sector, particularly the two supermarket chains, must be addressed. They have been driving down the price of wine and beer and fuelling the preloading generation, which has become the norm in that new generation of drinkers who've had virtually none of the restrictions that we had when we first started to drink. Mr. Speaker, I don't think we would be brave enough in this House to take wine out of the supermarkets. We should set a minimum price that would prevent wine being sold for less than $2 a standard drink. This new generation does its own cost-benefit analysis. I call it a price trash analysis. How little can I spend to get trash? That's what these young people do today. And I'm talking about people in their 20s and 30s. I'm not talking about people under 20. Mr. Speaker, that's what happens when the prices spiral down, the harm climbs higher. Mr. Speaker, there's been an exponential growth in off-licences, and in fact the amount of alcohol now consumed from off-licences opposed to on-licences has actually flipped. There is now twice as much alcohol consumed that has been bought from off-licence premises than has been bought on-licence premises. And it's a measure of inequity as well. A study done by Otago University showed that the lower socio-economic suburbs were likely to have more liquor outlets than any other suburbs. And that is fuelling the problems that we see in places like South Auckland. Mr. Speaker, we cannot ignore the enormous burden that we are all being invited to carry for the sake of those who are causing harm in our society. As Sir Geoffrey Palmer said, not everyone drinks in a manner that is harmful, but the consequences of harmful drinking affects us all. Mr. Speaker, we have to want change to happen. Alcohol is not an ordinary commodity. It ought not to be treated as such. It should not be advertised or discounted, as both of these are designed to increase consumption, which does nothing to fit the harm reduction objectives of a responsible regulatory regime. Mr. Speaker, there is a connection, well-researched and evidence-based, between accessibility and harm. Accessibility is about the convenience of the outlets, their hours of operation and the price. And all three of them have to be addressed. And Mr. Speaker, I say that sooner rather than later, as later will be too late for too many.